Hello and welcome back to Sustainable AF. In this first series, we're introducing the Sustainable Development Goals, known as the SDGs, a framework designed to help us build a more sustainable and climate-friendly future. My name's Felicia. I'm a writer, advisor and teacher specialising in the transition to a low-carbon sustainable future.
And I'm Alex, a former fixed income specialist, now building a regenerative agriculture startup.
So this week, we're going to be talking about life underwater. And this is an exciting topic. The Earth is called the blue planet for a reason. The oceans and seas cover 70% of the planet.
Yep, this is a big one. Over 3 billion people depend on marine ecosystems to make their living. And it's estimated that goods and services that come from the ocean are worth at least $2.5 trillion a year, making it the world's 7th largest economy. About 2/3 of the world's population rely on protein sourced from our oceans.
But we're still learning. Just to give you an idea of quite how much we actually don't know, it's been estimated that we only know 230,000 of the estimated 2 million species living in the ocean. And at the same time, more than 80% of the ocean has not yet been explored. And of course, since it's difficult to protect what we don't know, only about 7% of the world's oceans are designated as marine protected areas.
And this is really big. Our water systems are a fundamental driver of the functioning global ecosystem. And we rely on our water systems and therefore ultimately our oceans for food, energy and water. Tidal and wave power offer big opportunities for the energy sector, even if they're not fully yet commercialized, but oceans are critical to addressing climate change too.
Now, biodiversity, life on land, which we'll talk about in the next pod, and in the oceans, which we're talking about today, has an impact on the overall state of the climate. And the state of the climate system is key here. The one thing underlying all our concerns about life underwater is how much of life is going to be underwater if the sea level rises. Under some of the new scenarios, water levels could rise by 1/3 of a metre. And that goes up to 2.5 metres if high carbon pathways are followed.
And if you think, Fee, about how many major cities are located on waterways, it's scary. New York, Mumbai, the Thames.
And if you think about it, think about why, think about the history. Cities are built on waterways because hundreds, thousands of years ago, that's how you move goods around. You know, that was the basis of the international economy and supply chain. You put things on ships, you put them on boats, and you move them around.
And we are managing to do untold damage to these precious resources and the ocean ecosystems that support them. More than 1/3 of the world's fish stocks are overfished, meaning they're being taken out of the ocean at a rate that they cannot replenish themselves. Now, illegal activities adds even more pressure to this fishing problem, degrading the marine environment and exacerbating all the other problems that we face.
And illegal fishing is a big enough problem that every year the UN tries to highlight its negative impact. And they call it IUU, illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. Experts have actually suggested that more than 1 in 5 landed fish is caught illegally. That's over 22%, with this rising to as high as 1 in 4 off the coast of Africa. Every year, an estimated $26 to $50 billion worth of revenue is lost to IUU.
This is especially important given that one of the key actions that individuals can take to address climate change is to shift their dietary intake away from industrial meat, and that often means industrially caught fish. Overfishing and pollution are destroying ocean biomass. We cannot put forward enough how bad this problem is from fishing. 70,000 industrial fish boats kill millions of fish every year and then just dump them. Fish we never see or even hear about because of bycatch.
And not only that, but the oceans themselves are becoming increasingly acidic, which actually affects both life within the ocean and its ability to act as a carbon sink. So we've talked about the fact that the oceans cover 70% of the Earth. They've got a reported asset value of 24 trillion. This is a major economic and biological crisis. You know, given the fact that we've got 2.5 trillion every year being generated in value by the ocean and ocean economic activity, it's only logical we should invest more resolutely to protect it.
Absolutely, Fee. And we've spent an entire podcast series researching all these different goals, and none has hit me as hard as the ocean crisis that we have at the moment. So we really need to focus on this. The reality is that pressure of population, the overconsumption, extraction and waste and dumping of our current economic models are destroying the oceans. And it's only by showing nations their interest in protecting the oceans that we're going to be able to change the direction of travel. Given that the oceans are a common good, we need to work across borders and silos to make this effective.
Okay, so let's just talk about the goals and targets. So, we know how absolutely fundamental to the ecosystem is the water circulation process that drives precipitation. When it comes to extreme weather, storm development over the deep ocean, that's connected with freshwater systems. But we've talked before about freshwater in our pod on SDG 6, clean water and sanitation. Today, with SDG 14, it's very much about the actions that need to be taken to conserve and sustainably use the oceans. The closest we're going to get to freshwater today is looking more closely at the edges, the coastal systems.
The targets under the goal are seemingly very simple, and that's reduce marine pollution, everything from plastics to nitrogen fertilizer runoff, protecting and restoring ecosystems, reducing acidification, regulating fishing to restore fish stocks, end counterproductive fishing subsidies, increase the benefits from the use of marine resources, increase R&D for ocean health, and support small-scale fisheries.
And now, this might seem like a huge list, but it's an interconnected network of themes that we can actually address with new ideas and approaches. So, for example, Pacific Island states launched the Parties for Nowra Agreement, where they actually got together to create something they call the Vessel Day Scheme. Together, they decide what level of fishing is sustainable. They divide that amount into fishing days, and then interested parties, commercial fishing boats from China, from the US, from the EU, all the commercial fleets, they can bid for those days.
Super interesting, Fee, and I love that as a concept. Do you think it's scalable, though?
There's only one way to find out, and that's try.
Absolutely. And if you take these Pacific Island states as an example, local profits have grown from 50 million to 500 million in just a decade. Hugely important funds for a network of island states that are under threat from climate change. If one nation has no fish for some reason, they can sell their days to others, which means regular income for social expenditure. It's a simple but a very effective idea.
And what it shows us is how simple ideas can have such resonance. And that's one of the things we actually need to understand when we look at the different scales at which we can implore the impact of the destruction of the oceans. We need to look at what it does to the environment, but also to look at the level of human reliance on the oceans, whether that's fishing and the livelihoods in coastal communities to new opportunities from, uranium farming to algae farming.
Now let's look at economic resilience and fishing. Fishing is a really big problem, especially at the large commercial scale. Outside of the 200-mile limit for fishing zones is pretty much a free-for-all where anything goes, from dragging fish nets and dredging, pulse fishing and beam trawlers which catch unmonitored and often tons and tons of fish that just get wasted.
Small-scale fishing instead generally uses sustainable practices that can actually help restore ocean life. There's a real difference between industrial commercial fishing and small-scale fishing. Industrial fishing involves enormous ships like super trawlers and large bottom trawlers and catches hundreds of tons of fish every day. It often aims to get as many of the same few species of fish as possible out of the ocean in one go. And the problem with this is it drastically reduces fish stocks, as well as leaving utter devastation in its wake.
Fundamentally, this way of fishing is completely unsustainable. Even without this really negative dredging, bycatch sees young fish get caught up in nets, with too small of a mesh. Turtles and dolphins often get entangled in ghillie nets, as well as seabirds, including endangered albatross. They get injured by hooks unless deterrents are put into place. Again, this highlights the negative effect on biodiversity from this particular type of fishing.
So low impact fishing practices, often used by local fishers, can catch smaller numbers of a wider variety of species, and that it means that the fish stocks themselves can remain healthy. Now, this boosts local fishing communities' economies, but one of the problems you have is that unsustainable fishing, industrial fishing, destroys the opportunity for sustainable fishing because they remove most of the fish. And even if they don't remove most of the fish, they often destroy their habitats, again, through dredging.
One could argue at the moment, there is no such thing as sustainable fishing. There is a sustainable fishing practice, but we're at to a point where fish stocks have been depleted so much, we kind of just need to find a new way to engage with the ocean and let fish stocks and marine ecosystems regrow. And there's another really terrible problem that we've researched with industrial fishing, and that's the major issue around hidden subsidies that drive poor fishery practices. This is at a policy level now, as well as slavery and forced labour are understood to be common factors in illegal fishing and have become this hidden subsidy that allow some corrupt distant water fishing fleets to remain profitable and participate in overfishing. The fish supply chain is global, and that means that hiding fish within that supply chain is an easy thing.
So the thing is, it's not just overfishing that's the problem. Environmentally, there are huge problems caused by waste. I don't know whether you know this, but back in 2010, humans dumped more than 8 million tons of plastic into the ocean. Now, to put that in perspective, that's 5 grocery bags of rubbish for every foot of coastline around the world. A study undertaken by the World Economic Forum said that without taking action, by 2050, the weight of plastics in the ocean could be greater than the weight of fish.
But it's not just consumer waste that we need to think about. 20% of current plastic pollution comes from fishing gear. Shipping is a huge problem too. Think about the vast cruise ships, which dump their shit, quite literally, into the oceans while pumping out vast amounts of CO2, as shipping has yet refused to agree an effective CO2 limit. Supertankers do the same, but they also bring toxic paints, oils, and other materials, dumping waste into waters, and if they crash, terrible.
So the latest research on ocean pollutants from IPEN shows how incredibly highly persistent chemical pollutants that comes from things like supertankers, how they're affecting the reproduction and behavior of marine animals. It impacts their immune systems. It affects their ability to respond to disease and basically reduces their chances of survival. And let's not even get into the conversation about the impact of microplastics in digestive systems, because we're slightly worried about those on people as well.
Yeah, that's a very scary one. And there are other problems too, more than just plastic waste, and that's dead zones. Whilst this name may be a dramatic term fit for a zombie show, these are low oxygen areas in the oceans and lakes. There are few forms of life can survive. They occur because of a process called eutrophication, which happens when a body of water gets too much nutrients, such as phosphorus or nitrogen.
And the thing is that these things, phosphorus and nitrogen, are actually emitted and make their way into the ocean because of the way that we undertake agriculture and industry. Now, obviously, as well as population growth. All of these things end up with large amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus being released into the system. These then enter our air, our soil, and our water. I don't know if you know this, but human activities have emitted nearly twice as much nitrogen and 3 times as much phosphorus as natural emissions. And obviously, different levels of the world emit different levels of these nutrients. But of course, it's the ocean system. It spreads around. It's like the atmosphere. Something that goes wrong in one place is going to have an impact somewhere else.
Heavy use of animal slurry and commercial or industrial fertilizers in agriculture are the main contributors to eutrophication. Runoff from large agricultural fields enters creeks and bays because of rain or irrigation practices.
And you see, the agricultural side of things, the industrial side of things is what we talk about a lot. Population growth is not talked about as much. But if you think about it, in the developing countries of Asia and Africa and Latin America, untreated wastewater from sewage and industry as well are the main contributors to eutrophication. Factories and sewage facilities can be less regulated than they are in developed countries. And sometimes wastewater is literally just dumped into rivers, lakes, or the ocean.
And this has to change because these dead zones can result in algae blooms, not good ones, the bad ones, which cut sunlight to the water and stop oxygen being absorbed by the life beneath them. Hypoxia is when everything suffocates, and it often follows algal blooms.
And this problem is spreading. Scientists have identified, I think it's 415 dead zones around the world. And these hypoxic areas have increased a lot during the last 50 years. So back in 1960, I think there were around 10 documented cases, and there were at least 169 by 2007. Weirdly, the majority of the world's dead zones are located along the eastern coast of the US. I wonder what that says about industrial and agricultural practices. But they're also around the coastlines of the Baltic states, they're around Japan and the Korean Peninsula. And there are 233 what scientists call areas of concern around the world.
Now, that is a lot of doom and gloom, but there is hope. And we will talk about that more in the next pod. But a system in recovery is one that once exhibited low oxygen levels and hypoxia, but is now improving. For example, the Black Sea once experienced annual hypoxic events, but is now in a state of recovery. Others, like the Boston Harbour in the United States and the Mersey Estuary in the United Kingdom, have also improved their water quality. These are the results of better industrial and wastewater controls. There are only 13 coastal systems in recovery around the world, so we've got a long way to go.
These things can be fixed, but what we have to do is change our approach. We have to change our approach to industry, agriculture, and the oceans. We need to find models that allow us to function economically, but that also support renewal and regeneration. And that's got to happen before we've completely destroyed the system that underpins all of our lives.
And that brings us on to a big nasty one that keeps me up at night, and that's ocean acidification. About 25 to 30% of all CO2 emitted is absorbed by the oceans. It's a huge carbon sink. But as it absorbs CO2, it becomes more acidic, which makes it harder for the oceans to absorb more CO2. More acidification means less carbonate, which means less of the material needed for shellfish to make their shells. This affects oysters, clams, sea urchins, corals, and plankton. Acidification.
And let's not forget, sorry to interrupt, but let's not forget that plankton is the very basis of the food chain in the ocean.
Absolutely. If that goes, we goes. Acidification is even said to affect fish's ability to detect predators. It's not just a problem in the ocean's ability to act as a carbon sink, but it could contribute to the destruction of the ocean's food web.
So one approach to tackling this is something that a climate crisis advisory group that Sir David King has set up thinks holds enormous amounts of promise. This is ocean fertilization, which actually takes advantage of good algal blooms. This is the idea of putting sort of iron-based materials in the sea to cause blooms of phytoplankton. They not only take CO2 from the air, but they lock it up on the seabed when they die. It also provides more support for the bottom of the ocean food chain. And King believes we could actually revive ocean biomass stocks, so fish stocks, to levels last seen 300 years ago within a relatively short time. And the best thing about it is that once you actually get the system up and running, it then becomes self-supporting.
Yeah, this is one of the geoengineering solutions that might actually work and does sound quite promising. Now, let's take a look at policing, something that's very difficult in the oceans. Most of the world's fish are caught in national waters of coastal states, within 200 nautical miles of their shoreline. A lot of unregulated fishing occurs, however, beyond that on the high seas, which covers almost 45% of the planet. So it's a massive area to try and police, almost impossible. Patchy regulation and enforcement in this vast area allow rampant illegal activity and exploitation.
And the thing is, when we talk about the high seas, it almost sounds romantic. It's like pirates and fun. But the problem is that actually piracy does still exist. One of the biggest problems actually is not illegal activity itself. And this is where a fishing vessel takes a flag from a particular country in order to take advantage of minimal regulation. It allows cheap registration fees, often low or no taxes at all, and more importantly, the ability to employ cheap labour.
Get this, 35 nations have open registries where an owner doesn't need to meet any nationality or residency requirements. Open registries conceal the true owners of a vessel, facilitate tax avoidance, and appalling worker conditions for seafarers, and are linked and have been linked to devastating oil spills.
And then there's also transshipment. This is where vessels fishing in the high seas for high-value species like tuna, they just offload their catch onto refrigerated transport vessels, which are commonly known as reefers. They bring food and fuel and bait and labour, and they take away the catch as boxes of frozen fish. This is not illegal, and it's a cost-effective way for vessels to remain at sea for longer. But because these boats don't come into port, it's really hard to determine whether the catch is legal or not.
Again, that sounds completely unsustainable to me, although probably pretty cost-effective. We need to look beyond that. SDG 14 calls for an end to harmful subsidies that contribute to overcapacity, overfishing, and IUU. The World Trade Organization has been trying to resolve this issue for nearly 20 years. And although it has failed to meet its 2020 deadline, that's partly due to COVID-19. There are signs a deal may finally be in sight. The new Director General has made fishery subsidies a priority and is convening a ministerial conference with the aim of finalising negotiations.
Now that's exciting, and it would be fantastic if politicians and policymakers actually do something about it. But, it's one thing to create a policy, it's another one to enforce it. Better monitoring, control, and surveillance are what we use to defend marine protected areas globally. And there are increasing efforts, both at an industrial and national level, to increase the traceability of seafood. And that includes technologies like vessel monitoring systems and automatic identification systems, and even onboard electronic monitoring. They're all helping authorities spot fishing boats that are working beyond legal limits.
I think technology is key to unlocking the solution to the fisheries problem. And there are other options too. If you look at stuff driven by the blockchain and the ability to record untampered paths from source to plate. In 2016, UK-based traceability platform Provenance piloted blockchain in yellowfin tuna loins and skipjack tuna supply chains, tracing products back to individual fisheries in Indonesia. The WWF New Zealand used blockchain in tuna longline fisheries in Fiji in 2018, while the Sustainable Shrimp Partnership in Ecuador links data from farmed shrimp to blockchain platforms run by the IBN Food Trust. This is all really cool stuff.
So it's not just technology, but what it works with. So consumers can already look for trusted labels like the International Marine Stewardship Council, which supposedly verifies that fish was caught transparently. You can use online resources to learn about which species are best to buy and when, and which ones to avoid. We've even got the opportunity to put pressure on our country's representatives to reach an ambitious deal at the WTO negotiations.
Totally. As always, it's going to take a systems-based approach and not one silver bullet to sort this SDG out. But the problem is that the nature of fishing means that it is hard to prove the validation of MSC or dolphin-friendly certifications. How do we actually know that what we're eating comes from a sustainable process or source? We need to start somewhere. So these are a good start, but how do we improve these processes so that they might be more meaningful.
And it means different things to different people. The French NGO Bloom did a report which said that 83% of MSC certified catches between 2009 and 2017 involved really damaging fishing methods like deep sea bottom trawling and dredging. The MSC argued that the sustainability of a fishery is not just determined by its fishing gear or its size, and that even the big commercial fisheries need to be able to apply for certification in order to improve the management of fish populations on a global scale. So for them, it's about building up awareness and understanding and pushing the fishery industry in the right direction.
And when you think about it, as a business model, they're quite literally destroying their own business. If they carry on as they are, they're not going to have an industry. It's very short-term thinking to be just pushing for quarterly results rather than trying to address the collapse of your industry. But so maybe what we need to do is combine both these processes. Certification standards like MSC are not just about data, but about practices and processes that ensure sustainable harvesting and effective labeling to remove fraud. With the right data, it could become a lot more robust. But really, blockchain is about data. If we want to see change, we need to change the mindset.
And that's true across everything to do with the oceans, about a lot more than just fishing. Marine protection is really important. Think about the Trump administration and the issuing of licenses to drill for oil in Arctic waters. Marine protection areas are supposed to prevent certain types of fishing, protect certain species, but that doesn't always happen.
At the moment, much of the action to protect the oceans are by threatened nations and activists like Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd. Greenpeace, for example, dropped boulders off the coast of the UK in Brighton to stop dredging, also highlighting the fact that marine preserves are announced, but that doesn't mean they are actually protected.
So it's all about follow through. There are solutions to the problems we face. We've touched on these in terms of ocean renewal, driving growth in ocean biomass, regulating fisheries, changing economic models to new and regenerative approaches, but it's all reliant on international cooperation and enforcement. And that means that the politicians are going to be in charge. Negotiators at meetings like the WTO, they only have the power to reach agreements that their bosses have already approved of.
And that kind of means that it's up to us to push our politicians to act, to demand that companies pay attention to their impact on our oceans, that we make choices that push companies towards better, more regenerative behaviour.
And with the policy approaches, we need to look at them at different scales. So we've seen with the NORA agreement, how that can change the way in which fisheries are managed. But maybe we should reform the entire subsidies regime and maybe pay farmers to be marine conservationists and help farmers by giving them carbon payments as well as the current subsidy payments given to fishermen.
Absolutely, Fee. I think this is a great idea. Obviously, it's forward-looking and we need a better price on carbon to make this cost-effective for these farmers, but it's a win-win in my book. The fact that marine protection orders don't seem to work could mean that we should find ways to realign capital towards new processes, approaches and technologies that could transform our oceans. Given that the value of oceans, simply economically, is at $2 trillion a year, when we look at the value in terms of their ecosystem services, this could be something much bigger that we've got to address.
Now, there are already technologies being developed to address things happening in the ocean. Boyan Slat famously came up with an idea to remove waste from the Pacific garbage patch with ocean cleanup. That even projects that with the right fleets, it could remove 90% of ocean plastic by 2040. And there are new industries upcycling ocean waste, which we've seen hit the fashion industry. Plastic can be turned into shoes, into skateboards, even into yarn and become clothes. You can even connect it to freshwater management with plastic dams that have been put on rivers, and they've actually proved very successful in Guatemala. And never forget the importance of campaigning. Think about how the way people think about plastics has been changed by campaigns around plastic waste and by programs like the Blue Planet. David Attenborough, yay.
Big dog. There's even work developing underwater robots to track what's happening. smarter nets to catch specific species, or create less stress to fish, and entirely new industries to be developed here. Aquaculture farming, for example, kelp farming helps clean water, support fish stocks, and helps sequester carbon as one of the fastest growing forms of vegetation. It can reduce nitrogen impacts by up to 20%. Seaweed can also be used as a food ingredient, not just for people though. Researchers at the University of California, Davis have found that feeding seaweed to beef cows can help reduce their amount of methane they produce by up to 82%. And in bioplastics, regenerative ocean farming could be a game changer for the global food supply chain.
And it's not actually just the food supply chain. There are even algal farms developing biofuels for energy as well. Known as third generation biofuels, they actually have a natural oil content greater than 50% of the biomass. Algae are a remarkable candidate for biodiesel production. Not only that, they can be modified to have a higher oil content, or even to convert CO2 directly into fuels like bioethanol and biomethane using photosynthesis. So basically, what we're saying is there's an awful lot we can do. There's opportunities in the ocean, and what we need to do is rethink how we address it.
As ever, we've cantered through one of the most complicated and arguably one of the biggest goals in the SDGs at a rapid rate, but we hope it's given you something to think about. Now, you can catch up with us on Instagram and, of course, on our podcasts. If you're interested in what we have to say, like us, rate us, subscribe, and tell your friends, please.
Yeah, and so next week, we'll be talking about SDG 15, life on land, which, Alex, I know you just said we've cantered through one of the most complicated goals, but I keep thinking every time we do one, it feels like the most complicated goal. So anyway, we hope that you will join us next week as we continue on our journey to becoming sustainable AF.